The greatest change in Europe was not, as a Congress of Vienna feared, political, but rather it was economic and social, caused by a different kind of revolution, perhaps the most dramatic revolution Europe had ever experienced, the Industrial Revolution. Europe had thrived really from the period of the Middle Ages on the system of capitalism founded upon those twin pillars of private property and the profit motive. Capitalism had flourished first in Italy, where the Italian merchants made great fortunes from the Mediterranean trade, then north of the Alps in the Low Countries, and then expanded throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. It had proved sufficiently powerful to withstand the centralization and the restrictions of mercantilism, such as those centralized regulations on trade and industry imposed by Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Louis XIV. And it was sufficiently flexible and dynamic to meet whatever market needs could be identified, in fact, to uncover new markets and to create new demands in order to increase profit. It was Adam Smith who articulated the Enlightenment economic theory that underlay capitalism, because the Enlightenment also had an element of economic theory behind it, important economic theory that was seen to reflect the same interest in property and freedom that the political theorists that we've discussed also enjoyed. Smith was interested in understanding how individuals or nations obtained and kept wealth. He wrote a great book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was printed in 1776. This book became the Bible of laissez-faire capitalism, that is, an economic system that opposed regulation of any kind because regulation distorted the natural balance of industry, unquote. He believed that incentive, that is, the desire to have more and produce more, would in fact drive the individual to acquire more goods and consequently other individuals to produce those goods so others could have access to them. And this would reveal the hidden hand that shaped the economy and made it self-regulating. Well, it's not a coincidence that Adam Smith was a British subject. He was a Scot, and that Great Britain provided the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution. By the 19th century, Britain had achieved a level of material prosperity, of international influence, territorial expansion, wildly out of proportion with the island's size and natural gifts. How could this be? How did this happen? Well, private entrepreneurs had access to necessary capital in England, for example. Necessary capital that could be invested and reinvested in new ventures. So we can see that this capital came about not just because of the concentration of wealth in private hands, but also as a consequence of the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. The creation of the Grand Old Lady of Threadneedle Street was one of the economic revolutions, in fact, of the latter part of the 17th century, because the central bank was able to support the growth of the national debt, to offer low-interest loans to the government and to investors alike. It also fulfilled other important roles like establishing a value for currency. You knew what the pound sterling would be worth because the Bank of England determined what it would be worth. You also realized that the rate of interest would be reasonable because the rate of interest was, to a degree, driven by the rate of interest charged by the Bank of England. So the financial revolution of the late 17th century helped finance the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th. And a government that supported economic innovation, as the British government had done, and which they signaled with the foundation of the Bank of England in 1694, indicated that Britain was in some ways an unusual place, a special place in terms of economic innovation. So those great Whig aristocrats and wealthy city merchants who had brought about the glorious revolution of 1688 and the coming of William and Mary also brought about the Bank of England. And it's that union of power and wealth, acting through Parliament and acting through agencies that were of the state but not controlled by the state, that allowed England to have an economic advantage that outstripped any other state on the continent. Moreover, there were other things, very, very important things that were specific to England alone. Social mobility was possible. In fact, it was relatively easy in England. The social structure didn't restrict individuals according to legally defined classes. In France, for example, as we've seen under the Ancien Regime, you were born into one of three estates, or you achieved one or three of the three estates because you achieved the clergy. And if you were born into the nobility, then you had to behave as a noble. If you were born into the third estate, you had to behave as a common person, and you were defined by law. In England, though, this wasn't the case. There was no legal definition of class. And as a consequence, the aristocracy and the gentry, unlike in France, became willing partners in the growth of industry. This became extraordinarily important. In France, if a nobleman engaged in trade, he was dérogé. He lost his noble personality because he wasn't acting like a noble. In England, only the eldest son of an aristocratic family carried the title. All of the other sons were commoners. And so regardless whether your father was a duke or whether he was a wealthy merchant, you had the same opportunity to engage in trade and economic activity. The other thing is that private property was protected in England. This was something that John Locke recognized when he talked about those inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property. Montesquieu said the English are free in part because they have their property, and the property is protected by law. This is incredibly important in the creation of a modern economy because it permitted citizens to invest and put their money to work. If you weren't secure in your property, if you thought the king was going to come and take it from you, then what you would do is put it in a tin and bury it in your garden. But in England, because you knew the law protected your private property, you were willing to put it out to interest. You were willing to invest it. You were willing, in fact, to risk it because you knew that, first of all, the property was yours and you could do what you wanted with it. And secondly, you knew that whatever profit should accrue from that, you would be able to keep. Another important element was, again, something that Montesquieu saw, and that was the significance of the division of power. Parliament represented the various groups in society, and the House of Commons represented that complex mix of wealthy rural gentlemen and also city merchants. And those city merchants sitting in the House of Commons were able then to use the power of the state, to use Parliament itself to break down tariff barriers and protections that had restricted the expansion of trade. They realized that their wealth was going to be greatly increased, and consequently the wealth and power of England would be increased if trade were freer. So Parliament worked to try and reduce the restrictions on trade, not only within the country, but also between England and its colonies. Political and social freedom also supported the entrepreneurial spirit. And this worked in an unusual, in fact, a unique way. Among the English population, most engaged in economic innovation and investment and the beginnings of industrial expansion were religious nonconformists. Those who were not members of the Church of England. Consequently, those who were not part of the elite. Those who were separated out from society and consequently had to make their own way. And this was a small portion of the English population, some 10%. But the nonconformists were to represent nearly half of the leading industrial entrepreneurial families. Why? Why this extraordinarily important contribution in the hands of religious nonconformists, such as Quakers, particularly Quakers? First of all, because they were nonconformists and because of the operation of the Test Acts, they couldn't access the traditional universities of Oxford and Cambridge. So they couldn't get the traditional classical education. They couldn't be part of the elite by gaining the education that characterized the elite. Moreover, they had different interests, and so they founded their own schools called dissenting academies. And these dissenting academies didn't teach just Latin and Greek. They also taught useful trades because their non-conforming religion stressed being useful, utility, serving the community. And science was particularly important in this because they truly believed that God was revealed through the book of nature. So they were curious about how nature worked, and they began looking at ways to try and uncover God's plan by looking at God's creation through nature. The other thing was quite an interesting one. Because they were nonconformists and because they were usually of a rather fundamental religious perspective, they lived soberly. They believed that they had the responsibility to lead a godly life, and that meant no conspicuous consumption. That meant that they had a greater degree of disposable capital. Capital that they could invest in industry and business, and in fact, they did. In fact, generally, the social, intellectual, and cultural environment in England favored technological innovation and experimentation, partly because there was the empiricist tradition that dated right back to Bacon and Newton. Those things that characterized the English practicality, the emphasis on experimental proof, the emphasis on empiricism. But there were things that were correctly identified as well by Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu that also added to this. There was a free press. And indeed, in comparison with much of the rest of Europe, the press was relatively free. And this was critically important in terms of innovation because it allowed ideas to move easily. If you had an idea, you could write about it, and you could write about it freely. Because there was a free press, there was a great demand for reading material of all kinds. And as you were interested in particular things, particular journals and magazines and periodicals began to appear. Technical publications that carried technical information directed towards a particular trade or a particular industry began to proliferate. So consequently, if you were interested in the latest innovation in your own particular industry, you could find a particular periodical that was directed specifically to it. The other thing that England enjoyed was very little guild control over master workmen. On the continent, the maintenance of guilds, where journeyman and apprentice had to work under the control of a master and then ultimately only late in a career enter the master's role by producing a masterpiece, reinforced conservatism. A closed system, a very conservative system that didn't really emphasize, in fact, didn't really allow for much innovation or experimentation. In England, because there was no guild control, innovation and experimentation were celebrated. On top of this, something we've mentioned but really must stress once more, there was a representative form of government in which members of the middle class not only could vote, but also hold public office. So the House of Commons could speak for this middle class, this dynamic economic group that wanted to expand trade and industry and use the levers of government to support it. On top of this, the practical infrastructure, the technical education, the lack of guilds, all of these things that allowed for the explosion of technical experimentation in Britain and the freeing of ideas that permitted innovation to be celebrated and broadly circulated. There were other elements as well that reflected how this actually worked on the ground. And this was, I suppose, most evident in what were called the intelligent artisans. When we look at those individuals who actually invented the machinery, who began changing how things were made, creating new industries because they had a clever idea or a new way to make an old product, you see that men like James Hargreaves, Richard Arkwright, James Watt, these weren't university-trained scientists. They were tinkerers. They were the ones who made improvements on existing machines. They were active tradesmen who worked with these machines or who worked with a product and were looking for better ways to do it. These were the kinds of people who tinkered in their garage or their cellar in order to make a piece of equipment that would benefit them immediately. So there may have been great theoretical scientists on the continent who were coming up with great theories about how the world could be changed. But in terms of making a better widget, there was nothing better than a widget maker who spent all of his spare time with bits and pieces of widgets and widget making in order to ensure that his widgets would be the very best there were. And once he discovered the widget, what could he do? He went to London and the English Patent Office. There was a patent office that protected that widget once it was improved. Inventions were protected under the patent law. This too is critically important because it meant that if you did make a better widget, then the value of that and the profit accruing from it would come to you, and it was protected by law. And if others wanted to use your widget, you could then license it and make money in turn. There was every encouragement then to experiment, every encouragement to engage in the technological explosion that was happening in Britain. Well, there were other things as well that gave Britain a particular advantage besides these political, social, and technological things. England possessed natural resources that fueled the Industrial Revolution. In particular, England is blessed with huge reserves of coal. And as an unintended consequence, in order to get the coal from the coal vein up to the mine, the pit mouth, you had to have some kind of car, some kind of trolley. And it was quickly realized that if you put a car on rails, that in fact it was much easier to move heavy things. And it was from this, of course, that ultimately, with the application of Watt's steam engine, that the railway developed. Well, besides coal, there was access to water. England's an island, and so coastal trade was very, very easy. England is also rich in rivers, so you could in fact use rivers, dredge shallow rivers, or build canals to link rivers. And this then provided a very effective way for moving heavy goods, coal and iron, the basic elements that create the foundation of an industrial economy, could be moved easily and relatively cheaply. And then there were the roads. Because England was a united country, because it was centralized and relatively peaceful, the roads were safe. And also, the roads were maintained relatively well. Increasingly, moreover, because it rains a lot in England, the roads were graveled. By putting gravel on the road, it allowed for access even during inclement weather. So the technological heroes, to some extent, of this industrial revolution were not just the tinkerers who created new bits of equipment, but engineers, the vast majority of whom were Scots. Men like John Metcalfe, Thomas Telford of Iron Bridge, and significantly, since we're talking about roads, John McAdam. McAdam had an idea, and that is if you mix gravel with tar and put that on the road, you then would have a surface that would allow for the movement of goods, including heavy goods, with a relative degree of security because the wheels wouldn't get caught in the muck. Well, what he invented was what the British call tarmac. In fact, it was tar macadam. Tarmac is in fact just an abbreviation of the name of this 18th century Scot who realized that the roads could be made much safer. And indeed, the next time you're caught waiting to take off on Heathrow and the pilot says that you're on the tarmac, now you know, in fact, where that term comes from. The man, to some extent, who invented asphalt. The implication of this, to us, is very insignificant. It meant that in 1700, you could move about the island of England at about 5 miles an hour with some security. In 1800, you could move about at 10 miles per hour. It's not very fast to us, but it's a 100% improvement and something that again gave England that economic advantage. Besides the technological changes, late 17th and early 18th century Britain saw an agricultural revolution. This was one of the most important, in fact, it was a necessary precondition for industrialization. By 1750, there were no major obstacles, such as feudal relations or any kind of link between the individual and the soil that was legal or contractual in nature, to keep people from moving from the countryside to urban centers or to wherever the factories happened to be. In other places in Europe, as we've seen, the peasantry was often bound to the soil, if not by serfdom, then by contractual relations that meant it was very difficult for them to move. And in England, one of the sad events, but nevertheless one that ultimately had extremely positive implications, was the enclosures. The enclosing of estates brought effective farming to large tracts of agricultural land. It destroyed forever and finally the medieval communal systems of agriculture, which were extremely inefficient, extremely labor-intensive, and not particularly useful as the population is expanding. So enclosure, while certainly dislocating large numbers of agricultural workers, produced far greater yields that allowed more people to have richer diets. Also, when fields were enclosed to allow for the pasturage of animals, you could pasture wool, you could pasture sheep. And those sheep, of course, produced wool, which became one of the raw materials for the textile industry, for which the Industrial Revolution in Britain became known. But the important thing about this agricultural revolution is that an ever-growing population was made possible by ever-increasing production of food. The population increase because of better diets meant that there were larger markets at home to buy the new products that were being produced, supporting industrial growth. It also ensured that there would be a large supply of relatively cheap and highly mobile labor that would be able to work wherever the factories should develop. This increase in population was extraordinary. Between 1750 and 1820, the population of Britain doubled, producing, as I suggested, both workers and consumers. The better diets had created increased rates of fertility, and one thing that's not sufficiently recognized, and that was Edward Jenner's introduction of inoculation against smallpox. In the 1790s, when Jenner began inoculation, he reduced almost to extinction the terrible epidemics of smallpox that used to occur with great regularity in the island. This too increased great fertility because it was often young men and women who would get smallpox, and an increased life expectancy. It was the textile industry that was the first to feel the effect of the factory system and industrialization. And in part, again, we can see how all of these things were linked together. You have an expanding population, and this expanding population needs to be clothed. So there was a mass market for cheaper clothing, cheaper textiles. Moreover, people wanted to try and replace the heavy wool garments that they had traditionally worn in the 18th century. And the reasons for this are complex, but in part because cotton was becoming available. Also, cotton garments can be washed easily and dried easily, unlike woolen garments. And as has been suggested, one of the reasons why there was a great increase in fertility rates was the common wearing of underwear by the poor. Now, next to their body, especially women, they had light cotton fabric that could be taken off and washed with regularity, greatly reducing the incidence of disease and increasing fertility rates. Well, cotton wasn't just the production of long johns. Cotton was, in fact, a chosen product because England had privileged access to the two great cotton-growing regions of the world, India and America. So the cotton industry then was something that was cultivated because England had access to the raw material, something that other nations did not, and it was something that was greatly desired, this new light fabric. So by the late 1780s, the only industry that had almost universally huge factories and mills, and also new inventions continually coming online to revolutionize production, was the cotton industry. So when we hear of the spinning jenny of Hargreaves in 1764 or the flying shuttle of 1733, what we're really seeing are those machines that allow the production of high-quality cotton cloth at low price with increasing mechanization. After 1784, James Watt, a Scots instrument maker, again, and a classic tinkerer, introduced a steam machine, an engine that could be employed by Arkwright to turn his invention, which was a water frame, so that a mill did not have to be located by running water. The significance of this is not just the application of power to the operation of machines, it also permitted mills to be constructed close to markets, close to labor, or more usually, close to raw materials and the vehicles for transportation like canals or rivers. The Industrial Revolution then became possible because all of these things came together. And the tinkerers coming out with these new machines that were continually revolutionizing industry changed the face and nature of not just the English landscape, those dark satanic mills that were identified by Romantic poets, but also changed the nature of English society and politics and the economy. Cartwright's power loom, which was introduced in 1785, could turn fine threads into finished cloth. And now, because these were relatively cheap, middle-class people could wear the finest muslins that just a generation before could only be afforded by the extremely rich. And when the American Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin to remove seeds and stems from cotton, it again added to this continual change to allow cotton to be produced even more cheaply. It wasn't just the cloth itself that was changing the nature of English society. It was the way people looked. And it's something that we're going to come back to in a subsequent lecture because it's really an important element, the outward and visible sign of change and the ability to manifest and celebrate change in the way you act, the way you dress, the possessions that you have, things that we're going to see in a later lecture characterizing 19th century middle-class culture. Well, these things would be impossible without this Industrial Revolution and the kinds of innovations that we're discussing, especially the tinkerers who put new machines into the factories. In 1774, the discovery of chlorine permitted the chemical bleaching of cloth, which meant, in fact, that cloth could now be crisp white and colored, and you no longer had to bleach them in the sun. But just 10 years later, in 1784, Tom Bell's cylinder allowed the printing of cloth to be done completely mechanically, increasing production by 100% and reducing the amount of skilled labor required to zero. Anyone could turn the cranks and operate the cylinder to produce the brightly colored calicos and those brightly colored dresses and fabrics that began to appear on even the members of the lower middle classes. These brightly colored clothes became extremely cheap and readily available. If you took someone from 1700 and transported him or her back to London or forward to London in 1800, one of the things that would be most astonishing, the way people looked, the way they dressed. Because in 1700, the poor and the middle class dressed in drab, brown, and black. This was the traditional garb of people who could buy clothes but couldn't buy very much. But by the end of the 18th century, they were wearing brightly colored clothing. They were wearing dramatic expressions of their own individuality and their own place in society. And this then created a desire for fashion, for diverse fashion, and in fact, the desire to ensure that even members of the lower middle class could participate in changing style and to celebrate their individuality in what they wore. The system of supply and demand continued to spiral upward during the last quarter of the 18th century. And the significance should be demonstrated by a simple fact, that in 1700, England imported less than 2 million pounds of raw cotton. But by 1780, it was importing 18 million pounds. This example from the cotton industry could be paralleled in so many others because so many other industries benefited from the same kind of innovation, imagination, and a set of opportunities. Just think about the implications, though, of any industrial expansion. Ironworks would have to expand in order to build the equipments for the machine. Coal mines would be deeper because you could introduce steam-operated pumps to pump out the water to allow the mines to go ever deeper. Shipyards would be expanded as trade increased and you needed more ships to carry the raw materials from the corners of empire and the finished products to their markets. All of these things together, put together in a package, proved without a doubt to those who were observing that Adam Smith's theories about the marketplace were right. There was an unseen hand guarding British industrial expansion. It was increasing the nation's wealth. A greater proportion of the population was benefiting from this new wealth than could ever be imagined. The factory owners and the middle class of managers and professionals who service the system. Economic growth and social mobility enabled more and more Englishmen to participate in this new economy, and consequently this economic expansion gave rise to new demands and new desires, to new social, political, and economic ideas that we will see enshrined in the political ideology of liberalism. The rise of liberal political parties, not only in England but eventually on the continent, pursued the fundamental principles that we have seen in John Locke, who is recognized as their spiritual founder: political freedom, economic freedom, protection of property, and inalienable rights. Liberalism then became the ideology of the middle class, and we will discuss this at length. But there was another side as well. Industrialization created new problems, problems never before seen. A whole new class was created, industrial workers who lived on subsistence wages and worked in deplorable conditions. And as a result, there was both guilt and outrage. Guilt on the part of the middle class who were benefiting from the labor and suffering of these people, and outrage on the part of other members of the middle class, and general outrage on the part of those who were suffering. This group too developed their ideology, the ideology of socialism, which would become the ideology of the working class. And both liberalism and socialism emerged from industrialization, and we will discuss these in future lectures.